Hello all, and as promised, I wanted to introduce Baudrillard's text, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, and also really skip around with really what Baudrillard has to say about war as a concept, a simulation, and how it will actually impact the so-called real war, if you'd like, or at least the states of affairs of it. And there's a lot of really debate and discourse around Baudrillard of how he diminishes or perhaps just doesn't take seriously the real. But I think Baudrillard is trying to tell us that, there's a dissolving of that concept of the real with the hyperreal. And, as demonstrated with how he had his own issues with the Matrix films, that difference between the real and Ion, the entire real thesis or theme, if you'd like, for Baudrillard when he talks of simulacrum and simulation is, of course, that dichotomy, that binary is no longer really relevant for us going forward into the 21st century as he was concluding in the 20th. And I think, controversially, of course, this piece in particular, or text, is really indicative of that sort of reading into Baudrillard where perhaps, he diminishes real events, real casualties for this simulation. And of course, Baudrillard, he's not really doing himself a service by, calling this text, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. But I think I want to start there because the title itself is actually a key into really understanding this text and just Baudrillard's project as he goes from simulacrum and simulation into his, later stage of works and just a later stage in life and as a whole. But really we're seeing an emphasizing of the presence of the media and its significance to the point where, one of, I think, a great example of a philosopher is how, their ideas kind of become more concrete, flesh out into the real world, and not just a sort of predictive capacity, but really in these sorts of really interesting anecdotes where you have these sorts of moments that happen where you really think, oh, this thinker, he really gets it. And I think that was, the case here with Baudrillard and what he says of the hyperspace and the hyperreal and the significance of that and really our attention to war as a significant simulation, if you'd like, as opposed to the actual events themselves. Because, of course, the people who are on the front lines, and this becomes more relevant as you go from the Gulf War to any of these, and of course today, we have, two wars going on. And, anytime since really the Gulf War, as he'll point to us, that you really cannot differentiate between, what the significance of the simulation of war is as compared to the war itself, because, of course, and as I said, that famous, real aha moment is where, people on the front lines of the Gulf War and since then are, tuning into these information tunnels, whether it's cable television for the Gulf War or, as we see with these decentralized, Twitter accounts that are showing raw footage, you can perhaps, see how that will apply to the real, where you have people on the front lines in the events themselves actually turning in to see the hyper-real version of it, as opposed to just standing outside and being able to, recite the states of affairs as they happen. Of course, Baudrillard would say that that's not really neutral either with television and the pictorial image comparison. But nonetheless, if we were to humor that, you get that raw sort of experience, and yet, people on the front lines during invasions and whatnot, we've seen over and over again, they're turning into the spectacle, even though they are actually the spectacle in and of itself. And so Baudrillard is really, I think, playing with that for us here and trying to show us how, even our idea of the real and the simulation significance, you can't really, untangle the two anymore. And I think that was demonstrated here where, people are paying attention to see where fighting and the end of a ceasefire and the disturbance of peace is coming about, through these information avenues. And so we really want to pick up with the Cold War in the Baudrillardian sense, where you have Saddam and the United States, of course, fighting over what he calls a sort of corpse of the real war. And so mobilizing war in such a fashion as to convince ourselves, and of course if you've been following the Baudrillard videos on the channel up through his thinking at this point, we have these sorts of strategical ways of instantiating the real, of making things real to us, whether it's sexuality, Marxism, our ideological convictions, of course, whatever the case may be, the economy, politics. We are always trying to use these strategies as a way of making the simulation or the order of the simulation more real to us. And so, of course, Baudrillard isn't saying the war didn't happen, but wants to exemplify these two matters for how war now is a sort of satellite, an uncoupling away from nature, if you would like, or at least a new zoning of nature, as perhaps if we want to stick with Baudrillard's thinking. And so, number one, he says we can't consider this to be a war under any circumstance compared to a traditional conflict. And number two, there is an affinity with mass media in the abolishing of space or territory. And so again, if we want to put this title into a sort of literal, autistic, if you'd like, interpretation here, when he's saying take place, he's, I think, veering us towards the specifics of a milieu, of a territory, and a people who really comprise that territory, or imbued, if you'd like, into that culture, and it's sort of reflective in, the milieu, if you'd like, of that territory, of those people. And so Baudrillard is saying, with this affinity with mass media and these images, that the Gulf War did not actually have an actual place. It was in these hyper-real spheres. That is where the simulation of it was. And, its presence, this sort of hyper-real extension, if you'd like, is really where the war is taking place for Baudrillard, as opposed to just these, geographical locations or really specific people as they resist, in the Saddam case, against this sort of global system that the United States embodies. And, just to reiterate and kind of, package together, as I said I wanted to do in the last video, with, the wars taking place now in Russia and the Israeli and Palestine sort of, unthawing of their sort of cold standoff in recent decades. Of course, we could perhaps, take a second here to, look at how, this conflict is sort of imagined, if you will, or being presented to us. And, one of the insights that Baudrillard, of course, points out, and I said I wanted to put in other times where he talks about war in addition to this text, is really his analysis of the Vietnam War. Now, of course, if you know about the Vietnam War and, of course, the Apocalypse Now portion of the last text we went over, then you would see that one of the things Baudrillard wants to point out is in the war of simulation, in the hyperreal spectacle, if you will, America had won that war before it even began, simply by making the Vietnamese somewhat globalize themselves in the sense of embodying the other against this system. And this ultimately becomes what formalizes and defines really and gives order to us and how we understand someone outside of it. To be more concise, perhaps we would consider how one of the great complaints or problems that Israel has had with Palestine in particular is that lack of formalization. There's no let's just go up and talk to the head of the Palestinian state. Now, of course, there's been I'm sure incidents where someone tried to take upon that mantle and be a real leader, but Palestine, they kind of have that sort of even affinity, if you'd like, certainly with how Deleuze would see this lack of formalization as and really the minoritarian and those sort of flight paths, if you'd like, you're way more dynamic without actually formalizing themselves. But of course, with Baudrillard, he's kind of saying in that sort of way, Israel is, critical of Palestine for not formalizing themselves. Baudrillard is saying, of course, that makes sense with how, the global system wants to formalize and really even put the outside, or at least, come up with a sort of concept and rationalization, if you will, for how they could be on the outside of this, global hegemony, if you'd like. And so I think that's an interesting insight to perhaps slide in here again with Israel and Palestine, because you see this analysis that comes up quite often with how Palestine, who do you negotiate with? In that Baudrillardian sense, perhaps this is good for the Palestinians, because Israel seems to really want whether or not you want to take Israel at face value and say, they only want peace and they want to end this conflict as soon as possible. So, formalize a sort of structure that we can actually negotiate with. But, as we've seen with Baudrillard and demonstrated in a lot of these postmodern readings, trying to actually not just, form a sort of articulation against such a system, you're actually perhaps playing into that hand. And that, of course, is a huge theme with Baudrillard's thinking. And now, without that digression taking us too far away, I want to discuss what he thinks of hot war. And so hot war, of course, is World War II, really. The Cold War is sort of embodied with the missile crisis. And as a Cold War, the concept of a Gulf War then can occur really for Baudrillard, because, the impossible exchange and fatal strategies, he locates how humans, or at least even the idea of a soldier, is now like a hostage. And it's an analogy really for how the entire world, of course, in this, post, hydrogen bomb, World War II, post-apocalyptic, if you'd like, with at least the images, you can be wiped out, of course, in the press of a button. And this goes for any opposition against any nuclear states, quite literally. And so what is our autonomy, really, then, for our politics, for our ways of life? We're simply hostages to these national systems that can, wipe the entire human race off the face of the earth simply by pressing a button. And, what does that make for autonomy? What does that make for, going up to this nuclear power and challenging it in any sort of tangible way where this is an option? You can't really have that then. And so there's this aspect that he talks about that's interesting with the non-war manipulation, or hostages are really the purest products of being taken away from that sort of traditional warrior, or a simulacrum of the non-war. And so we go from that warrior class to one of hostages, and that conception or the embodiment of the traditional war of greatness, of discipline, of dying for your people and territory, is replaced with people who don't really have a choice. They cannot oppose any sort of aspect of life to any meaningful way because we are simply hostages. And so we're all hostages of media intoxication, induced to believe in war, and we're ultimately confined in that simulacrum of quarters, really. And so we're not expected out of us to really be able to challenge such a notion of a war, if you'd like. Saying a war did not take place, it would be an absurdity where you have these pictorial television and universally neutral, that Baudrillard, of course, is suspicious of. He doesn't think that's real, real in insofar as, what it says or claims to be in that sort of neutrality. These are just the states of affairs as they're happening, and we're just pulling out our cameras. That's not the case. And history, of course, is definitely not a neutral. And so we're ultimately hostages to such a truth. And so we are hostages insofar as that we cannot reject such narratives that come from raw images, if you'd like. And I think that's really fascinating with, this lack of ability to really form any opposition without just simply being declared hysterical. Now, if you're familiar with his ideas of exchange, then this is going to couple nicely with what Baudrillard really sees of the Iraqi opposition. And to him, it's an absurdity to how, you have hundreds of thousands, or at least 100,000. I can't remember the specific number for the Gulf War here, or the numbers he was particularly looking at. But nonetheless, either way, you have 100,000 plus casualties, whether it's civilians, soldiers, whatever the case may be. And, on the imperialistic front, or the American front, if you'd like, you really don't have those sorts of statistics. And how can this really be considered a war then? This is more like an invasion. Of course, the Iraqis are going to continue to, go through with attacks, if you'd like, defend themselves, because, of course, their territory is being abolished quite literally and inhabited. So, there's no way to really, end that sort of conflict or struggle. But to call it a war, there's no real exchange. There's this sorts of clean war against a sort of, national genocide, if you'd like, of the Iraqi people. And so this really goes into how the invasion of Iraq and the notion of U.S. as this sort of globalizer, or imperialistic figurehead, to render really the mapping of the world to a single global rationality. And so, whereas in a traditional war, you have a more, of course, dialectical or retaliatory response and exchange, but not in the Gulf here. There's no real exchange to be had, no real, if we would like to, get really weird about it, with Juvenal, interesting, associates, mass democracy, mass global liberalism, if you'd like, to how, that's treated as compared to the symbolic exchange traditional societies that Baudrillard talks about earlier, where you have retaliatory response, where even something like the mercenaries that, opposed each other on the battlefield, they still had this sorts of, code, really, amongst men who were ultimately just trying to defend their ways of life, their dialectic, if you will. And, that is now gone or awry with the rise of this clean war concept. And so the media then convinces people that a war is taking place by showing, all this frontline footage that you're always bombarded with, especially in, the internet culture today, where, in the hyperreal sphere, you could perhaps see and likely did run into images while these, recent conflicts have been going on, where there's no real reference actually to those images. They could have been, hyperreal, or at least, presented in this hyperreal sense, but you don't actually have, it could have been a war from 20 years ago. It could have been a national conflict in, a despotic third world country where there's just, gunfire, and you wouldn't know any difference from whether or not it was, in Ukraine or whether or not it was at the Gaza Strip. This is very, well, not just interesting, but actually terrifying insofar that, we have, this, expansion really of what Baudrillard saw of, the media convincing people of the war by always, showing the missiles going off and, the territory being inhabited by these frontline lives. And, you're just sort of repeating it, and then you have to live through it over and over again in the simulation. And now, it's almost like a new stage has emerged where you don't even have really the reference to the actual conflict that's ongoing that you want to be presented with, or, try to gain sort of knowledge or facts about, and actually see that sort of rawness, if you'd like. And now it's supplemented, and you just have this sort of footage from all across where these technologies were able to be referenced at over and over again. You can just have this sort of perpetual war then. And I think you see that, of course, with politics, where Baudrillard, of course, talks about the corpse of war, how we're fighting over its sort of traditional dead corpse. And that could be exemplified, I think, with how any sort of big political project, any sort of group effort, even in team sports, there's always this, talk of, we're going to war, the war on poverty, things of that nature. Just, I think, shows, at least in that Baudrillard sense, we don't really know war in that sort of way anymore. And so we can always just, reference it in the hyperreal. But we have no idea what this sorts of exchanges that really happened between these people, these tribes, these our ancestors, quite literally, and now we just have this sort of hyperreal. And so Baudrillard, when he talks of advertisement, he really notices how there's this need of this eradication of difference and the need of confronting who opposes that American logic and how it's presented to us. And the TV, of course, is totally indifferent and will, show these war images and proliferate them, and then shovel these advertisements for appliances, for, a new car, for your next vacation, because, of course, this is a clean war conflict. There's no actual real presence in any of these places. It's simply this sort of drone presence where you just act violently onto the enemy, but we have nothing to actually exchange. So in our minds we just zone off to the next advertisement. And so the media promote the war, and the war promotes the media, and advertising competes with the war in its promotion. And so promotion for Baudrillard is, this sort of thick tusk of culture that would actually survive nuclear annihilation. And then he leads into how advertising competes with the war. But, perhaps this has come to pass really because you have this sort of network and collaboration as a sort of instrument of that globalizing effort in the system that has an affinity with, promoting such things, promoting the sort of logic, if you'd like, in between war, or at least the sort of ratings that you would expect. I remember when the Iraq War happened, this is sort of anecdote here, but when the Iraq War broke out and there was an actual invasion in 2003, many of the kids in my age group, we were like, Call of Duty's on TV, so we wanted to watch CNN and tune into the war. And of course, there's tons of advertising going on trying to sell me a super soaker, and so I can act out this conflict with my water gun in the backyard. And I think that applies really with this idea of advertising still sort of competing with the spectacle of war, but it also collaborates. They feed into each other in this sort of almost healthy competition of promotion of the advertisement promoting the war and the war promoting the advertisement. And this really leads nicely, I would say, to how you have the will to spectacle, where advertising in the Gulf War is the obsession of the spectacle being confirmed. This is, the realest of the real, with the idea of people actually dying, of a conflict actually unfolding before our eyes and, moving history. That's real. And, Baudrillard in this piece, though, he's a bit weird insofar that his terminology kind of changes as he goes into this later stage, and then a lot of it you actually never really see him use these sorts of terms the same again. There's a very specific Baudrillard insights here into his pieces about war that don't necessarily or are as congruent with the rest of his thinking, that I think is actually kind of interesting. Some people might actually think that that's a bad thing. But nonetheless, I'm not going to pass judgment here. He uses, different terminology, for example, with, the spectacle, and, the war maintains or saves the idea of the war. So he's really tapping into how, illusion could actually be a very detrimental and oppressive thing, actually, to go so far. Whereas, of course, in other works, as we've gone over on the channel, illusion is, more of an opening for Baudrillard, and actually could be served to get away from an oppressive system that's trying to, formalize everything. Of course, he's against those sorts of, mass proliferated narratives that encompass and rationalize every act of life. And so the political aims of conquest or domination as the primary driver of prior wars is now replaced with this war in which it is a war to save war. The war serves to maintain the allure of that war itself. And so war and its connection to the functions that make the hyper-realization in war is recouped in that sort of way. I think this goes into what I said earlier with how war and its sorts of the terms and the way it sort of invokes organization within people. And so if you can war on poverty, again, you can kind of like drum that up, or a sort of war room effort, if you'd like. And I think that's sort of trying to drive at the sort of significance, trying to almost act as a sort of libido, if you'd like, towards urgency, and trying to have aims of conquest or domination is now really replaced with these the images of those things still nonetheless, but in a much hyper real way, if you'd like. And so Baudrillard famously declares that World War III did not happen, as we've already passed it. War could not take place after the atomic war, and a mode of deterrence of leaving the global system, such as the case of the assault onto the Japanese. In this case, we can eradicate the confrontation with this technical ability of course, these weapons of mass destruction. and as such, war cannot take place with such a such a condition. And of course, you know that term, weapons of mass destruction, of course, was the narrative that fueled the Iraq War in 2003, and in that sort of case, again, you see the global system that says, well, under no circumstance, whether the intel was real or not, ultimately America, at least the public, the democratic system, if you'd like, or the population, bought into the idea that there's an enemy who could perhaps get his hands on such, weaponry systems, and that calls into question our own weaponry systems and our own legitimacy, and we have to get rid of that. And that's interesting to couple onto his idea here of already being past World War III, because we cannot have a future or autonomy if the confrontation against the simulacrum of a system that doesn't allow for boundaries to be broken, or when they are actually broken, it's actually the system itself that's allowing such a boundary to be broken. Because of course, if you have the finger on the red button and you're getting pushed around, or the system is sort of malfunctioning against this sort of opposition, you are by definition allowing this opposition to take place, because you have within your arsenal the capacity to be able to wipe them out at any point. And so again, that's what Baudrillard's trying to say for why there can never really be a World War III, or at least how we imagined with World War II, because of the way in which World War II ended and how it sets the conditions after that. And so in the example of diversity, I take it a step further, and I'm going to put in my own thinking. Of course, I've never been shy of that here. In the proliferation of diversity today, I think you can inject a Baudrillardian suspicion towards, again, a system that's now calling for the diversity of a nation, or really the global system. And I think in that Baudrillard sense, again, or at least in his vogue, of when you see that kind of assures to you that that's the actual end of diversity. We're trying to actually use this as a sort of strategy now to get away from how entrenched the global system and really lack of opposition and opportunities to be against that system, with the idea of diversity and these what we could consider these sites of contestation. And this is, again, another Baudrillardian term where you have other materialized or manifestations against that operative system. And so Baudrillard recognizes the global elite as cannot being imaginative or tolerating, again with Hussein, the other, so they make war to the ulterior to destroy it. And again, this couples with how you have that idea of the clean war, or simply the violent act where there's no actual recognition. You're not even inhabiting the territory in a sort of traditional way to even allow such an exchange. And so this sort of zero casualty effort on one side to impose mass, clean violence onto the other, which doesn't allow for a sort of response. This is, in that Deleuzian sense, the war machine, which of course is more than just the act of warfare. The war machine is what allows the states to ultimately become a sort of apparatus of capture. But the war machine, when it ultimately just becomes about war, or the war is justifying itself through the war machine, this is a sort of idolatry in the act of having it for its own sake and its own legitimacy. And so war is conducted for taking the hyperreal form of, the idea of total success and victory. And of course, you see this in, the left and the right in our discourse, where, you want to own the other one. You want to have total success or victory. That goes into the sort of significance of how warfare is seen in the hyperreal. And so, the oppressive act and that lack of being able to have a sort of illicit response to that act is what makes the system so menacing for Baudrillard. So war in the hyperreal form, or the illusion of the virtual, God and how he could save us from the illusion of war, and the illusion is in that so far as the oppression. Illusion, as again, it's not celebrated here like in other texts, is really a descriptor of the oppression as opposed to illusion being a sort of opening. But here, the illusion is of the virtual, or the war that convinces us of reality and loses how it manifested and its sort of meaning in that sort of traditional, or even how we used to be as human beings and how we would consider meaning of a war and how it's exchanged. Baudrillard effectively is saying here that, the rest of history, in that sort of Whig view, if you'd like, didn't culminate towards, us and, everything is a sort of evolution and this sort of process until they reach the hyperreal, if you'd like. No, it's actually to say that, the rest of history before, they had this sort of symbolic exchange, but it is only us now who have, reinvented how war in the simulacrum actually takes place. And so the Gulf War did not take place, since the war was won in advance. Such, of course, is the thesis with, again, what he says of Vietnam. America won the movie in Apocalypse Now and didn't need to win any sort of actual conflict, but to only impose Vietnam into that global framework. And so the threat of a sort of guerrilla warfare, which, there's an affinity among the postmodern or post-structuralist with, that sort of decentralization and, not, giving the sort of formalization of a sort of, what would we, sort of arborescent authority, if you'd like, and instead in this sort of rhizomatic way. And so the threat really was that sort of rhizomatic way the Vietnam people were, or the threat against the American logic. It wasn't about communism. It was about the sort of allowance of having an ideological opposition to begin with. And so all the U.S. really was seeking was to be able to actually control the trajectory of such an energy, and consolidating that into a sort of war scheme or a global scheme. And so the global hegemony and rationalization of a trajectory of a people, such as the case of the jungle in Apocalypse Now, where, again, there's no face to any of these enemies. And in fact, the main antithesis in that film, I believe, is actually a rogue American. So again, even when there is a sort of opposition, it's still, one of our people who just simply went awry. And so you're thinking of the war in the context of two figures, really, of Saddam Hussein and America. And so Baudrillard thinks of Saddam as really the embodiment of all of traditional war, or at least that sort of symbolism of how he represented a sort of symbolic exchange, across the world. And of course, in that sort of way, we almost could see that Saddam's allies, or even the lack of, if you will, kind of drives home how, by being this sort of arbiter of this sort of symbolic exchange or traditional war and that sort of ideal, you could see how by doing that, loosely associated groups across the world against this sort of global system, even though they could have, far differing religious values or ideas of what the human life should actually be. It was ultimately embodied in how, anyone who was just simply opposing this new form of a lack of recognition. And you saw that in really the treatment of Saddam with, there was no bargaining, no, way of how hostages, not in that sort of hyperreal sense that we fall under, but, hostages in that sort of more material sense, there was no interest really in that. And, Baudrillard thinks that America is ultimately the satellite. And again, to go back earlier, as, America is actually what, veered off away from traditional war, from our traditional way of how we used to be. It's interesting how he sees it that way, as opposed to, saying, that there is a sort of culmination towards this, or a sort of ethos of progress. That's not necessarily clear. It's more about how, we're sort of the parasite, we're kind of the, quite literally the problem, if you'd like. And that sort of altercation demands a sort of rhythmic response. He talks a lot about rhythm in that sort of symbolic exchange, or the act of it. But America, again, with the clean war, the stealthy, the no zero casualties, no bargaining, no negotiation, you can't really exchange in that sort of way. And how we see a symbolic exchange can be thought of not as a means of actually obtaining, power or a cutting edge against the sort of American logic, such as the case with terrorists, who actually, for Baudrillard, works into that sort of system by being on the outside. And so the responses to globalization as a sort of necessary act, not as a means to get power, but as to say no to that global system. Again, you think of, all of the sort of strange bedfellows that could perhaps, or has come up through history, where, a dictator or a rogue leader went against the global system, and he finds himself surrounded not by people who actually really believe in a way of life, or maybe they do to some extent, but their coalition against globalism really is just about, we have this sort of mutual enemy here. And in that sort of sense, it's actually kind of interesting to couple that with, again, with symbolic exchange. And you can't really have that response. You can only reply by kind of formalizing yourself like the Vietnamese did against such a mammoth system, such a hegemony. And when we consider how, just as wealth is no longer measured by its own sort of metric, the secret, really, information in the sort of post-capital way, and of course this, you think of cryptocurrencies and, having this sort of access to early info in the early last decade, and how, everyone dreams of being that guy who, had this sort of speculative information, that sort of know, or wherewithal to know, hey, this is really going to take off. This is a similar case with how, wealth is no longer measured by the sort of metrics that used to go into productivity in that Marxian sense, and is now just about, speculation. And it's not really waged with the sort of vigor of hard work or its association, but of information claims in a space, in the same space that capital, of course, is also inhabiting. But now he turns really to homage to Marshall McLuhan. And he notices how McLuhan, of course, when he talks of the TV, functions as a medium. Of course, famously with McLuhan, as you know, the medium is the message. But for Baudrillard, TV is actually a medium without any sort of message. And so the consequence of the war in the media doesn't indicate anything, because war wasn't in the symbolic exchange, but ultimately of a sort of false promotion and advertisement. So again, you could kind of see, you're promised the symbolic exchange, if you'd like, but instead you get this sort of clean war because it's on the TV or the medium without the message. And so the pure form of medium, in a step towards McLuhan, the medium is a message that we no longer require a message, but only actually instantiate the medium itself. It's a very heavy and loaded analysis, really, I think, with Baudrillard saying that, again, the hyperreal, there doesn't even really need to be a sort of a message. And I think this really foretells how, in today's world, there's no really meta narrative or consensus really to be had in really any aspect, politics, economics. There's sort of different categories of specialization, and there's no real coherent message. It's kind of just these decentralized, almost like static, how like the radio static goes in different, directions and tries to capture onto waves. I think of that in a similar way with how, we never attach ourselves to one single message, but, we are in the mediums, though. The medium itself is what proliferates it, even though there is no actual message behind it. But he also makes this sort of calculation of the 500,000, and again, this kind of beefs up his argument of that sort of clean war and lack of exchange from American perspective. He calculates how, the 500,000 American soldiers that were involved in this conflict, 3 times as many would have died just doing regular activities. America, of course, is famous for its road accidents statistics because, of course, it's so vast, for one. But, just simply driving around in everyday life, being an electrician, if you like, or, doing a sort of an on-job that actually has a sort of danger to it, you were more likely to actually die doing that than being involved in the Gulf War. And I think that's very telling of how this is not a war. This is simply a violent response that, the other side, the other, if you'd like, are simply scrambling against. And so in the ultimate globalization will eradicate resistance or contradiction and conflict at the cost of eradicating, really everything that could potentially challenge such a thing. And so by prefiguring of an experimental blank war that's even more inhumane and without human losses on the American side. So again, where we use these analogies nowadays against war, that just kind of shows how we don't actually exchange symbolically in war. We don't understand how humanity's relationship with war once was, that pursuit of greatness, also the sort of treatment of the other, insofar as again, to reiterate to Juvenal's point of, how hostages were actually treated quite well before you simply sent the citizenry or the mass democratic soldier, if you'd like. And of course, he talks about how, there's no real difference between the sort of factory worker and the foot soldier after World War II. And I think that plays into nicely with how, Baudrillard sees the consequences here of, no longer having that connection to the human loss of what war could really bring about. And this is not a want, of course, for a return to, primitive battle, but really as a consequence of the liberal hegemonic system that we are living in. And so all that is singular and reducible was ultimately liquefied in the Iran-Iraq war as a sort of anti-Western, to reiterate, challenge, despite the fact that it failed. Again, to go into the sort of specifics of the geopolitics of how Saddam had to, or anyone really who opposes the West has to create strange bedfellows just to simply enter into this sort of exchange, which ultimately isn't really a traditional exchange. And so the more the hegemony Baudrillard actually warns, and to really end here, the more the hegemony of the global system oppresses and locks down, which it will have its will to, there's a greater chance that eventually, you overstretch, you will actually collapse and sort of eat your own tail. And Baudrillard, of course, paints that example that, many of the postmodernists, I think, are drawn into this sort of affinity that, eventually a system becomes so big. And of course, you think of something like as old as the Roman Empire, which of course has a lot of parallels to what we see with America right now, and sort of overstretching, forgetting, what actually went into the sort of culture and springtime of the imperialistic values and exchanges, really, for the winter stage in that Spenglerian way, where nobody actually really understands how and why those men were able to do the things that they were able to do. But I think I want to end here, and I think this might be my last video on Baudrillard for now. I'm considering doing a reading of The Ever-Present Origin with Jean Gebser, because he really kind of stands alone in the sea of postmodern thinking at the time from France, as someone who's trying to look at the modern or modernity in a different sort of way, and he has his own sort of process that he points out to us. And yeah, I think that will end this video here. I hope you guys enjoyed it and really enjoy all of these Baudrillard videos. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and share around. Perhaps even leave some comments and have some ideas of your own with how Baudrillard thinks. But yeah, thank you for watching.